Hello and welcome to the Warhammer YouTube channel. Today we'll be talking about Warcry, the new skirmish combat game set in the Age of Sigmar universe, and we'll be specifically talking about the Stormcast Eternals faction. We'll be examining the different boss and unit choices using some math, and we'll use that information to help come up with a few starting list ideas to get you started. So let's look at the data. Okay, before I get into the spreadsheet, just want to give you an idea. You're going to see some different colored cells, and for the most part, when I color a cell, I'm coloring it based on how that value relates to the rest of the game, not just this faction. So if you see cell values that are green and yellow, they're pretty much average, green being on the better side of average, and the more blue you get, the better it is compared to the rest of the game, and the more red you get, the worse it compares to the rest of the game. Now, a lot of the values don't fit perfectly into a normal curve, but it's good enough, and it's better than just randomly picking some colors. So the way I normally like to do these videos is I like to talk about the faction as a whole, and then start talking about the boss choices, and then the unit choices, and then give you my MVPs, and then give you my list ideas. So with this faction, I think overall, what you see here is a very strong ranged faction. So if you look at what this faction can do compared to the rest of the game, they're the only faction that really has ranged combat that approaches real elite levels of damage. And so depending on how your strategy is and how much you like ranged combat will determine whether or not you like playing this faction. But in general, most other fighter profiles in the game, when they have a ranged attack, it does not very much damage, so you're kind of relying on that range damage to keep yourself away from enemies, and hopefully that those small light attacks kind of pile up. But with this faction, you actually have extremely durable troops, and they're hitting from far away, and they're hitting for serious amounts of damage from far away. So it's a bit of a problem. There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of drawback. You don't seem to be paying the same kind of penalties for that ranged combat that you are in a lot of other things. So you're not paying it necessarily in having to take a hit on durability. You're not paying for it in light damage output. It's the only thing you're paying for it in is the units are a little bit pricey, but as we'll see in the breakdown, the points for what you're getting in all those categories still end up being not too bad. So in general, I think this is an extremely powerful faction. It may be almost problematically so, and just that the base spreadsheet numbers are going to bear that out a lot. But then when we start talking about the abilities, I think it really adds another layer to this faction. I think people have been asking me for a best and worst factions video, but I don't think it's going to be much of a surprise that the Stormcast Eternals, I think, would be clearly in the favored spot amongst all the factions. You just have so many tools with this faction. So you have these great ranged options, but then your two animal options, the Griffhound and the aetherwing that aren't ranged, they're also basically best in class amongst the entire game. And you could build great lists that don't even take a single one of those. So you just have great options galore in this warband. I would say any list you can come up with that gets anywhere close to being 1,000 points, no matter how random the assortment is going to be a fairly competitive list. There's not a way to make a really incapable and just completely incompetent list. Even the craziest things I could come up with in my list building attempts, I could see instances where they would win a lot of games. So let's get into it. Our boss choices. So the boss choices are going to mirror our elite troop choices perfectly. So we're only going to have to really discuss the fundamental differences here once. So you have three varieties. You have the Raptor Prime with the long strike crossbow. You have the Raptor Prime with the Hurricane crossbow. And then you have a Hunter Prime. So the differences here, the long strike has a maximum range of 20, but with a minimum range of 6. So he's not good at hitting things that are very close to them. So his strategy is going to rely on keeping a little bit of distance there. And he has all these units have a backup 1-inch range weapon. So the Hurricane version, he has a maximum range of 15 and a minimum range of 3. So that maximum range of 15 for most other ranged combat in the game is still pretty long. That's, there's a lot of ranged combat out there that doesn't reach this distance. It's only outpaced by the long strike version in this faction, and I believe the Bloodstalker with the range is also range 20. So you're still, even with just not being the longest shooting thing in this faction, you're still one of the longest shooting things in the game. So really strong distance there. In the Hunter Prime, he has a range 8 attack, but his as we'll see here, he's going to be more of a melee focused option. So he's primary melee with a backup ranged attack, and you're paying the price. The prices here vary kind of wildly. So 280 for this long strike, 245 for the Hurricane, and a pretty good deal at 210 for this Hunter Prime. The durability is the same across, so they're all toughness 5 with 30 wounds. So they're all super durable leaders. Not the most durable in the game, but up there. And particularly when you figure if your strategy is ranged, you're going to be staying away from melee combat a lot. So by the time enemies close ranks with you, they're probably not going to have very many rounds of combat to whittle you down. So as long as you play in the game right, I suspect that your leader will probably stay on the board for the majority of the game, and that there's certain scenarios where keeping your leader alive might be important. And I think you're going to be in good shape here. Okay, so let me scroll over. Oh, notably, before I move too far, the Raptor Prime, we're going to see what his overall damage output looks like. But just keep in mind that this is a really weird attack profile, and that it's only one attack, base damage 4, critical 10. So it's the highest critical in the game, and a very strong base damage as well. So this is a interesting to note here, and we'll examine that in the data later. Okay. So talking about the runes here, notably of course they all take leader because they're leaders. The long strike variants of the leaders and the troops are going to take this elite rune, and the Hurricane options are going to take bulwark. But notably that the Raptor Prime with long strike leader is going to also take scout. The scout rune is the rune taken by the aetherwing, so it's almost like you get a free aetherwing with your Raptor Prime. So I will save discussion of the runes for when I talk about the troops, I think, because I'll have all the troops on the screen to discuss. But just note that it is interesting. They're all these choices pretty much match the troop choices, with the exception of the leader for the long strike gets an extra rune. So interesting. Scrolling over, like I said, they're all the same durability. So the more expensive long strike, it seems to be a worse value on the points per wound. But I think ranged combat, if Hunter Prime he wants to get into melee more than the long strikes and the Hurricanes, real world effectiveness on how long this thing's going to stay around on the table, I think you're actually going to probably see longer living long strikes and Hurricanes than you will longer living Hunter Primes, because Hunter Prime he wants to get in there in that 1-inch range to do all of his work. So something to keep in mind, but none of these are bad options. Obviously the Hunter Prime's a good deal for his durability, and but these are for boss values. These are nice. So I don't really like points per wound specifically, because the strength and toughness way that mechanic kind of shifts things up a little bit. And in this warband, you have all toughness 5 for all your Stormcast guys. So it's important to make those adjustments. So if you haven't seen my videos before, the way I've calculated my data here changed from the earlier videos. So my last 2 videos have done it this way. So what I'm calculating here is how many average attacks from strength 2 enemies will be required to kill this fighter. So if if you have average strength 2 enemy out there, let's say they're doing 3 attacks per action, it's going to take 20 attack actions from that kind of fighter to kill this leader. So you can see it's going to hold up good against strength 2 attacks. So it looks like if you scroll across here, strength 3, 4, 5, and 6, it looks like, oh my god, strength 6, increasing your strength by 1, this kind of makes it seem that strength value is a hugely important number. But how I've changed this data from the earlier videos is that instead of just moving up the strength value, I've actually I in previous videos I had calculated what's the average base damage and what's the average critical damage across the whole game, and used that values for each of the different strength tiers, so they were all kind of normalized on the damage values. But now I've actually calculated the average damage and average critical damage for each strength tier, and so each of these columns are representative of the base and critical damage from that strength tier. So yes, strength 5 attacks you're doing a lot more damage than strength 4 attacks, but the fact that you move from strength 4 to strength 5 is only a small factor of it. A more important factor is actually that the average across the game of the base damage and critical damage values of strength 5 is significantly higher than the base damage and critical damage from strength 4. So all that factored together, don't worry about it. I've weighted all of these instead of just averaging them out based on how frequently they occur. So strength 3 and strength 4 attacks are the most common in the game, and based on the exact frequency of occurrence, I come up with this average attacks to kill value. So this is how many attacks across the whole game are going to be required to kill this fighter. So this is kind of a meta way to come up with a durability value that factors in the wounds and the toughness. And then you just divide the points by the attacks to kill, and you see our values here, and these are all not bad. So pretty average, but I'd say for bosses, these are very good values, and the Hunter Prime is an absolute steal for his durability for the points you pay. So 210 points, and you get 31.19 average attacks to kill. Great value, but obviously he's going to need that durability more, so he might survive a little bit less long. But okay. That's enough about the durability. The durability is great on this faction. Moving on to the damage. So what's the damage output? So I have columns here for the damage output against tier toughness 2, toughness 3, 4, and 5. There's no toughness 6 in the game, but obviously some abilities could bump you up to toughness 6 and so on. But this is a pretty good representation. And based on the frequency of occurrence in the game of the different toughness values, I've been able to come up with an effective damage. So how much average damage you're doing across any random assortment of enemies that you're going to come across. So that's how I get this column. And then dividing that by the points that you're paying for it, we get our points per effective damage. And you can see this is where the amount of points you're paying for the damage here doesn't look good at all. But for these ranged ones, it's I think most ranged combat in the game ends up being in the dark red here for points per effective damage. So it's just ranged combat's expensive, and you're paying. So you have to keep that in mind. But strictly on the points value, it doesn't look great. Even the melee combat of the Hunter Prime is quite he's quite an expensive model for doing that amount of damage. That's kind of on the medium low side of elite damage at melee. But you have to keep in mind he has this good amount of damage at melee. He's expensive, but then he has a backup shooting attack that is, if you look at all the shooting attacks in the game, this is one of the better shooting attacks. It's only 8 inches, but it outperforms a lot of other, certainly a lot of other 8-inch shooting attacks and even other longer range shooting attacks. So completely I don't think this is a bad. It's hard for me to quantify that. The fact that you've brought these two things together individually, they're both a little bit pricey, but to have that good of melee with that good of a backup shooting option is notable. But I think the real notable thing here is our longer range options. The Hurricane doing 5.09 damage. This is elite damage. It's on the lower end of the scale for elite, but you're able to do elite damage at 15 inches away. It's crazy, and it's not as ridiculous of a bad even points deal for that amount of damage. The Raptor Prime doesn't look as great when you first look at it. It's like, okay, we get an extra 5 inches, but for that extra 5 inches of distance on the long end, you have to pay for it. 3 inches of less distance you can hit on the short end. So it's, it's 6 to 20. So you can hit pretty far. It is notable that the board isn't like, you're never going to be able to get this full 40 inches. Well, I think the board's I forget the exact dimensions of the board, but if you put your Raptor with long strike directly in the center of the board, you can't hit the 20-inch circle around the base size, which is a 40 mil base. The whole circle that you can hit doesn't fit on the board, so it's not the actual. If you're trying to make some calculation of like area of the board that you can hit for the points that you're paying and whatever, he's losing out on that because his bubble of what he can hit is just a little too big for the actual board. But so this doesn't look as great when you compare it to the Hurricane, but as I said, the thing we have to keep in mind is that this is the effective damage, and he only does one attack. So if you're getting that on one attack, any type of ability that's going to add more attacks to you is going to just multiply this, very, very quickly. So, for example, the universal ability Onslaught, everybody can use, and it's a double. It's unfortunately one of the highest performing abilities in the game, and kind of renders so many unique, cool faction abilities pretty much useless. Directly useless or just not as good of a value. So I've calculated all the same way I've calculated the way the damage it does across the different toughness values. I've also calculated that, and I've hid the columns, but if you used Onslaught on that fighter, what is their effective damage output if you had used Onslaught? So that's what this column is here, and you can see. Oh, and then I also have a column here for what the Onslaught delta is. So this is how much effective damage gained by using that Onslaught double. So you can see the Raptor Prime goes up to 7.09 effective damage by using Onslaught. So he gained 3.55 damage for a single double at 20 inches. So he's of the entire game, he is the one that takes the Onslaught ability the best. Onslaught spent on a long strike is the best way to spend an Onslaught, and Onslaught's one of the best abilities in the game. You can imagine. So that makes this a very, very intriguing attack profile, even though it looked a little bit pricey and not super overwhelming. Like the effective damage of this attack profile is actually outperformed by the Daughters of Cain Bloodstalker. I think the Bloodstalker does 3.7 something effective damage. So initially when I was looking at this stuff, I'm like, oh, it's, the long strike is, he's surprisingly outperformed by other fighters. But then when I really started thinking about it, due to his doing this amount of damage with only one attack, he's just an insane beast when you use Onslaught on him. And then this faction has other abilities that can add to the attack's characteristic as well. So this is a real problem, what he can do. But okay, so let's examine our troop choices now. So we have the same three options in troops that we had in leaders. We had the long strike, the hurricane, and the regular hunters, and they're different point values, with the long strikes being more expensive, hurricanes being mid-range, and the hunters being the cheapest. But then we also have two intriguing animals here. We have the Griffhound, which if you saw my best and worst video, I gave him the nod for being the best semi-elite troop in the game, and we'll see that when we scroll over and look at his stats. And the Aetherwing, which I also gave the nod for the best chaff in the game. And so his stats aren't as impressive looking outside of the move 12 with fly, But considering that he's 45 points and move 12 with fly, and for how you use chaff in the game, he's an amazing value. And there's other similar things out there that move 12 with fly that don't have much durability, that don't do much damage, that are much more expensive. So one of the best point values for what he does in the game. So these two options are amazing, but then these three options are all pretty amazing as well. So there's just nothing broken in this faction. There's nothing wrong. There's nothing you have to avoid. No undervalued thing. I think there's things that are more overvalued than others, and we'll get into that. But this is just, if you just had a bucket of a bunch of Stormcast stuff and you scooped it up and dumped it on a table, you would probably have a dominant list, I think. So, okay. So the interestingly, with the boss versions versus the troop versions here, they all have the exact same attack profile. So a lot of times the boss version has a stronger attack and maybe a little bit more durability. In this faction, the only thing difference between the boss and the troops is the 10 extra wounds you get for the boss. So don't really need to examine the differences in the attack profiles. It is notable, though, that the long strike does not have the scout rune that the leader has, but when we get over the runes, we'll examine the what the elite and the bulwark rune do. And the poor Vanguard Hunter doesn't get a rune at all. So something to keep in mind when you're examining your troop choices, because these runes could be interesting. Okay, let's talk about the Gryph-hound. He's move 6, so he moves a little bit faster than your average unit in the game. He's on the better side, and he has a nice 4 attacks with base 2 crit 4. So a very strong elite level damage output with move 4. The only thing is here they knocked him down to toughness 4 as opposed to toughness 5. But not a big deal when you're sitting there with 20 wounds. So across the board, this guy's just going to be a great deal. The aetherwing is only toughness 2 and strength 2, but if you saw my video on how important are strength and toughness in the game, I think that these are overvalued metrics in GW's pointing system. So the fact that this guy is on the very low end of that scale means that I think the way that they allocated points to him, he's probably a good candidate to be undervalued. So okay, let's take a look at the runes now. So like I said, the elite is the rune for the long strike stuff. Bulwark is for the hurricane. Hunters don't get anything. Gryph-hound gets beast. Aetherwing gets scout. And of course, he's a bird, so he flies. Let's take a look at those abilities. So faction abilities, everybody gets this tireless hunters, which is just strictly speaking an upgraded version of rush. So you add half of the ability to the move characteristic when they make their next move action. Actually, I guess maybe it's a trade-off because it's only the next move that they make. So rush, you would add that value to both of your moves for the whole activation. If you made 2 moves, Tireless Hunter would only use 1, but that might more than make up for it, because if you use this on anything 3 and above, then you're going to get at least as many added move as you would rush. So potentially it could work out better than rush, but okay, but not a bad ability. Other universal, I guess that's the only universal here. The Scout, so this is the Aetherwings special ability. This is an interesting one. Pick a visible enemy fighter within 6 inches. Until the end of the battle round, you can re-roll 1 dice during attack actions made by friendly fighters that target this fighter. So everybody that targets a fighter that you warning cried against gets this re-roll 1. And I've calculated out the math to see whether or not that's worth it and how much added damage that's going to cause. I think a good rule of thumb on warning cry, it's going to be as long as you have 2 fighters nearby, it's it's the added damage of rerolling 1 dice is slightly worse than adding 1 dice. So if it's only 1 fighter, that's going to be slightly less valuable than using onslaught. But if if it's more than 1, then you instantly it's like having a slightly worse onslaught that two people can use. But then, since this is a completely different fighter and a completely different ability, you could warning cry something, and then the other fighter could onslaught it, and now you're, the effects of those are multiplying together. So I think this is a really solid ability, and a really good reason to take either the long shot boss or aetherwings, most likely aetherwings, because it has to be the fighter has to be within 6 inches. So with your long shot boss, you probably don't want to be moving him downrange just to use this ability, but it is something to keep in mind that it's going to be potentially, if your enemy gets afraid of this ability, that might be something that helps keep them away from your boss and keep them out of that 6-inch bubble that he can't hit with his crazy hard long-ranged attack. So something to keep in mind. Other abilities, the leader ability takes this righteous aura, and until the end of the battle round, add 1 toughness characteristic of friendly fighters. You can imagine that I'm not super keen on toughness, and if this was a strength 3 warband, toughness 3 warband, this would be super valuable potentially. If it was a toughness 4, it would still be okay, but a lot of your warband here is toughness 5. So this, as you can imagine, if you have a lot of Stormcast guys running around, the benefit from going from toughness 5 to 6 is really not good. So this is a dubious triple here. I think it's going to be undervalued, but I've actually worked out the math in the spreadsheet. We'll get to it later. The beast, this is going to be the Gryph-hound. Pretty simple here, just makes an extra attack action and then a bonus disengage. So that's a pretty cool triple. Help keep him alive and pull off a little bit more damage. I like this triple. It's a really solid, and just only adds added goodness for the already very good Gryph-hound. Bulwark. So this is what the hurricane guys are going to take. So this is pretty insane. Look at this. It's so it's a triple, so it's 1 dice more than onslaught, but you can add half the value of this ability, rounding up, to the attacks characteristic of the next action made by this fighter, this activation. So it doesn't. You don't double up on it like onslaught. So potentially, I guess I should have worked out the math on that. Where the break-even point is. So onslaught can be used for both of your attacks in the activation, and this one is only the next attack. But potentially, if you use it then on a 5 or a 6, you're going to get more damage output than if you use onslaught and done both of your attacks. So very nice, handy, helps get those hurricanes. Like, remember, the hurricanes are doing elite level of damage at range, so now that pushes them from elite to like I think it's still in the elite range, but like very on the high end of elite if you use this triple. So really solid triple. The elite, this is one that the long strike take. So add the value of this ability to the damage points allocated to enemy fighters by each hit or critical hit from attacks made by this fighter, this activation. I've broken down the math on this. I'm a little bit less enthusiastic about this ability as a quad. Just if you compare it to the amount of damage added by like the Bulwark's triple, it's gonna not be quite as high performant. If the conceptually this is a great thing, but the trick with those long strikes that use this ability is that they have very high base damage and high critical values already. So adding a couple dice points to it, yes, it helps, but it doesn't drastically move it like other things. So for example, if you had a fighter profile that had base damage 1 and critical damage 2, if you add a single point to that, it doubles the base damage and adds 50% more output from the criticals. But considering how much base and critical damage this thing already does, even if you add the maximum of like 6 damage points, you're only just getting a little bit above 50% more damage output from its criticals. And you're doing much more base damage output, but I think it would land you somewhere in like the 75% more damage range. So yeah, so in this one, I'm not sure I guess I probably should have worked out whether or not since you're not, the best case scenario here, you wouldn't be doubling. It's not going to double your damage output. It might make more sense to you to use just the base rampage. So I'm less enthusiastic about the long strikes ability than I am about the hurricanes ability, but I have the data to compare them. So let's move back. Okay, let's look at the durability of the different. Oops. So points per wound, you can see a little bit pricey points per wound for our base troops, but considering that these guys are ranged attackers that do ridiculous amounts of damage at range, I don't think that's a big problem. The added range is going to increase their overall lasting on the table, even because the hunter needs to get into that melee range, so he's going to probably be taking more damage than the raptor versions are. Gryph-hound, great deal points per wound, and just great deal in the well, I would say not great deal, but good deal in points per wound and his actual effective points per attacks to kill. So just good points for durability. And the aetherwing is not a good value for what you're paying for his durability, but this is, so if he was slightly, let's imagine that he was, 6 attacks to kill, he's probably not going to, this is across for average things in the game, this is probably going to require 2 activations on average to kill. If he was, 1 or 2 higher, he would still also be in that range of requiring 2 activations to kill. So being that he is so low, I think it is likely to induce some sort of like an overkill type situation. So even though he's to the point where his durability is so low that it doesn't, even though he strictly from a mathematics perspective, he underperforms here. I don't think in the real world way that the damage output breaks down, I don't think he underperforms terribly against other similar costed models. So this isn't as problematic as I think. But that being said, I think when you're list building, don't go overkill on the aetherwings, because if you do have, if you go up against another, for example, Stormcast list, they could probably shoot out, maybe 2 of these guys every single turn. So just be aware of that. Okay. So let's look at the damage output. Like I said, these numbers are exactly the same as the boss variants. So we're making that same decision here. The long strike doesn't look too great, but with onslaught, he's an absolute nightmare. The hurricane does notably, this is the highest damage based ranged attack profile in the game, and he's doing it at a comfortably long 15 inches. So very nice. And the Vanguard Hunter he still has a pretty good backup ranged attack, but he does elite level of damage at melee. So the Vanguard Hunter is kind of a safe choice among the 3, but I think, maybe just, I think a better player might make more use out of a long strike and hurricane combo and not take quite as many of the hunters. Okay, the Gryph-hound, he does the same amount of damage as he has basically the same attack profile as the hunter, but he's much cheaper. So his points for his damage are better. So there's the Gryph-hound is above average in all the different categories in terms of what you're paying for the model. He's a good deal for his damage, he's a good deal for his durability, and notably, he is movement 6, so he's above average in his movement. He has a nice rune, and that rune's going to help him stay on the board longer. So there's just no drawback to the Gryph-hound. And if the Gryph-hound was in any other warband, he would be the clear MVP, and I think most lists would just be built around the Gryph-hound, and you'd see these things all day. But he's unfortunately like an MVP on he's a star player, but he's on an all-star team, and maybe he might have to sit the bench because of your strategy. The Aetherwing, you're not bringing the Aetherwing to do damage, so it's just not his job. And likewise, he doesn't really do much of it, but it's actually not a bad value for what he does. So he does outperform a lot of other chaff options in just the strict damage output, but he's not terribly great. Really, the surprising thing with the Aetherwing is that you're able to get a move 12 flying creature for 45 points, and his ability that warning cry. We'll have the breakdown here so we can see how effective that's going to be, how much value you're going to get out of it. But it's a nice added ability, and it's nice enough that I think it's going to cause the enemy to try to chase around your Aetherwings and put some effort into clearing those off the table. And every turn they spend worrying about your Aetherwings is another turn that they're not worrying about your Stormcast or your Gryph-hound, and that's another turn that those things can be just whittling them down at range or in melee. So all kinds of good options here. So actually I will leave that up here. So as I mentioned before, we have the column here that shows you what the value, how much damage you're doing if you use Onslaught, and how much you're gaining from Onslaught. But now I've also done the similar calculation with Warning Cry, so you can see if you use an Aetherwing or you use the Vanguard, the Long Strike boss to use that his version of this ability, how much you're gaining from Warning Cry. So I'm sorry, this column is not how much you're gaining from Warning Cry. This is how much damage you're going to do on average with Warning Cry. And then the Warning Cry delta is going to be how much you're gaining from Warning Cry. So it is, strictly speaking, it's across the board, it's always lower than Onslaught, because re-rolling a dice is never as good as rolling one extra dice. So it can't ever beat it. But if you have more than one person potentially attacking that thing, then this is a really nice added bonus. Or if you're going to pair it, it's like maybe only one enemy is going to be attacking, or one of your fighters is going to be attacking an enemy that you're Warning Crying. If you're able to use Warning Cry with Onslaught, so the fighter that's attacking it, you use Onslaught, and then your Aetherwing that's nearby before the Onslaught person attacked it was able to Warning Cry it, then the effect, this added damage, is going to actually make the Onslaught delta much bigger. So those actually multiply together. So this is it's a cool way that you can really combo up and deal crazy amounts of damage. Okay. So I've also calculated here the Righteous Aura. Oh, and noticeably, I'm not expanding the boss options for these calculations, because the boss options have the exact same attack profile. So there's no point. If you're wondering how the bosses perform with Warning Cry, they perform exactly the same as these troops here. Okay, Righteous Aura. So Righteous Aura was the thing that did, it added 1 to the toughness characteristic of friendly fighters within 6 inches. And you can see here, this is the average number of attacks required to kill the fighter with Righteous Aura. And this is the delta, so it doesn't fit on the screen, but compared to the base number of attacks to kill, this increases the number of attacks required to kill that fighter by 0.5, and the Gryph-hound increases by 2.39, and the Aetherwing by only 0.41. So move, like I said, across this warband, the Gryph-hound benefits the most from this, but even then, it's a what is that? A little bit over 11% increase. The rest of these are really not good increases at all. So increasing 1 toughness on this warband specifically is just not very beneficial. I would caveat and say maybe it's not terribly bad if you have an all Gryph-hound army or warband, but I think even in that scenario, I think I would probably just end up, if you are taking that many Gryph-hounds, I think maybe the Gryph-hounds darting attack triple is more likely beneficial for you. So so here's the data, the proof. I don't think that Righteous Aura is just a good ability in this faction. Okay, so I'm going to expand the bosses. I'm going to hide these troops because I've kind of reused some spreadsheet rows here. Sorry if it makes it confusing. Oops. So what I'm showing you here is I want to talk about the rapid fire and the aimed strike abilities. So rapid fire was the one that the hurricane troops use, and that is the one where you add half of the dice value rounding up to the attack's characteristic. And the aimed strike is the one where it's the quad that the elite takes, where you can add add the number of the dice to the damage and the critical damage of the fighter. So we need to make a determination on when to use these. The rapid fire is a triple, and the aim strike is a quad. So how to read this is this column here is the dice value number that you would be using that ability on. So these things get better at the higher dice values, obviously, because it's what the basis of the ability is. So the only things that can use rapid fire are the hurricane, so both the hurricane boss and the hurricane troop. So I think attacks are undervalued by maybe the pointing algorithm and the game design. So adding these numbers to the attacks value is pretty dramatic. It really increases these things quite a bit. Let me actually scroll over a bit so we can see. Let me hide. I just like to always see how things compare to Onslaught. So we compare the Onslaught delta to the rapid fire delta. This is I think you would probably be using this at range, hopefully. So rapid fire, it's only the next attack action. So if you were using Onslaught, I think at the 3 and 4 range, it would be roughly the same, maybe exactly mathematically the same as using Onslaught for 2 attack actions. So, but if you use rapid fire on a 5 and a 6, then you're able to get more damage output than you would if you used Onslaught. And at 1 and 2, it doesn't outperform its Onslaught. So Onslaught is doing this each attack action, whereas rapid fire is only for the next attack action. Onslaught's a double, rapid fire is a triple. So I would save rapid fire and not use it on a 1 or 2. And I would only use it on a 3 and 4 if you only had 1 attack action possible to use it. So, but 5 or 6, use it anytime you have a triple and you want to help out your hurricane buddies. Okay. Aimed strike, like I said, I don't think, as you can see the numbers here, how much damage it's adding in comparison to rapid fire. It's just not as good of an ability. It's not adding as much damage as rapid fire is adding, and it's more expensive. It's a quad ability as opposed to a triple. So that's a strike against the long strikes. No pun intended. So this only applies to the long strikes ability here, or his damage. So you're adding, if you use it on a 1, you're adding an average of 0.6 and all the way up to adding 0.382 if you're adding a dice value of 6. But I think this one can be, this one can be used for both attack actions in the activation. So the break-even point for you here would be, well, really it would be only on a 6 would this be better. Then you would get more damage output using this on a 6 versus Onslaught, but everything else underperforms Onslaught if you use it from a long strike. So just be aware, this is just not a great ability. And so for something to not outperform Onslaught for being a quad is a really problematic thing. It's not like this ability can be used by everybody in the faction. This is only the long strikes, and the problem with this ability just comes down from the simple fact that the long strike gets its damage. It does heavy damage while only doing one attack. So adding one attack to a long strike doubles its damage output, which renders this ability mostly worthless. So if you had a quad, don't forget you could just use the quad as a triple, and if you took some hurricanes, you could get your hurricanes doing heavy amounts of damage. But okay, so to summarize, the long strike ability, aim strike, only ever use it on a 6, and the rapid fire, use it on a 5 or 6 anytime, and use it on a 3 or 4 only if you only have one attack to use it. So otherwise, just always use Onslaught. As a general rule of thumb that in this game, if you don't want to remember all this stuff, just only use Onslaught. It's by far the best and most consistent double in the game. If you just didn't want to play the double roulette on knowing what outperforms it and what doesn't, it's a pretty safe, consistent performer. Okay, so let's talk about my MVPs. So I think I'm going to give you an MVP for the bosses and then an MVP for the troops, because when I get into the list building, I think it's a good idea to bring at least one of these long strikes, because you're going to just create a threatening problem on the board, and you want, depending on what dice values you get, you might want to use their ability or but I think as far as an MVP for the boss, I think I like the long strike boss the best, because he gets the extra scout rune, so he's going to be, so if enemies do get close to them, they're going to have to worry about him. So if you keep another one of your fighters somewhat nearby to the Raptor Prime with long strike, and he uses the scout ability, then him and anybody else that's in range of the enemy that approaches you are going to have to worry about being warning cried and ganged up on and really beaten up. So it helps with his survivability that you create in that gap zone of his threat radius. So everything from 6 inches to base to base with him is going to have that threatening zone of his scout ability. So I like that, and it's just, otherwise, even without that, I think the point values among these are pretty consistent, and it would be hard for me to say that the long strike is a clear MVP. I think they would be very even with each other, and it's the same kind of sort of choices you make with the troops. So the fact that he gets that extra rune and it makes that extra little problem, I think I like the long strike crossbow as the MVP for the leaders. And the MVP for the troop, I'm going to go with the Hurricane crossbow Raptor. Elite damage at nice range is just a rarity in this game, and not having to use your double to get the elite damage. So with the long strike, you have to use Onslaught or your other ability to get into the elite damage tier. But these Hurricanes, they're cheaper. And I'm not sure if this extra 5 inches, I think it's nice to have at least one person on the board able to hit from 20 and, to cause problems. But taking more of these cheaper guys that can hit from 15 and do more damage at 15, I think in practicality makes a lot of sense. And their rune is just frankly better than the elite rune. The elite rune kind of sucks. So that's my MVP choices. Let's get into some list building. So as I said before, I think it's important to bring along at least one long strike. So I tend to prefer, I'm not going to recommend many lists here without a long strike in them. But that being said, I don't think there's a lot of bad ways to make a list. So I came up with some, just for an example of how it's hard to make a bad list with Stormcast. Let me give you two just ridiculous lists. These are not recommended lists. I'm just, just shooting from the hip, telling you some ridiculous things. So 1 Hurricane leader and 5 Gryph-hounds. So this is a nutty list, but if you look at the amount of durability you get on the table, the amount of movement and flexibility you get, the amount of damage output you're doing, and the runes you have access to, this isn't bad. It's not. It's weird that it's not. I think you're going to win games, and against this is an elite. This is a 6 fighter warband, so it's on the elite end of the spectrum. And even though it's a crazy, this is probably going to be one of the least competitive Stormcast lists. This is going to outcompete many other factions, competitive lists. So this is just this faction. The fact that this is not a good list in this faction should tell you something about how good this faction is. Another ridiculous list that I think, well, I couldn't take credit for, because I'm pretty sure if anybody's looked at this warband, it's probably daydreamed about putting this on the table, but 1 long strike leader, and let's just go with 16 aetherwings. So this is a bit like the birds from Hitchcock. So this is obviously not a good list, but that being said, I think you're going to win some games with it, because that many. I mean, you're with 17 fighters, you're just off the charts in terms of horde, and you're not going to be killing many fighters, really. I mean, the long strike you're going to be able to pump many of your doubles every round. You're going to be able to pull off an onslaught with your long strike leader, and you're going to have enough extra ether wings that you can actually create like a bubble around your leader and keep people away from him. And you're going to always be able to scout enemies, so you're going to be scouting plus onslaughting with your long strike leader. So you're going to be able to just do crazy amounts of damage each round from the long strike, and with enough ether wings that even losing a few ether wings every single turn, you're going to be able to keep them around on the table for a while. So just nutty lists that aren't all that terrible. Maybe this one's terrible, but because there's going to be some scenarios you just aren't going to be competitive at here with this list, but just weird wild list possibilities with this faction. Okay, enough of the silliness. Let's get into some. I'm going to give you 2 realistic list options, and I think the first list option is my least favorite, but if you either don't have Gryph-hounds and aetherwings or don't like Gryph-hounds and aetherwings, I think, so this is basically a Stormcast only list, the best one I could think of. And that will be 1 long strike leader, 2 hurricanes, and 2 hunters. That's only 5 models, but it's 1,000 points. So if you don't like Gryph-hounds or aetherwings, you're not going to get into that 6 model range very easily. Maybe not at all, but yeah, so it's going to be 5 models. So one of your deployment groups is only going to have 1 model in it, but when your model is, potentially 30 wounds or 20 wounds, toughness 5, hitting from range, like it's less of an issue as it would be having 1 model in a deployment group in another faction. So each of these guys is a real force of nature. Okay, and obviously I would put at least one of your hunters with your long strike leader in maybe in the shield deployment group or something. Just keep him a little bit protected. Okay. Moving on, my preferred list would be 7 models. So 1 long strike leader, 3 hurricanes, and 3 ether wings. So I think you're gonna have a lot of those ether wings buzzing about. Hurricanes dealing crazy damage. Long strike leader threatening everybody, dealing crazy damage. Just solid list all around. There's so many different lists. Ways to put this list together that's just really good. These are just good starting points here. Obviously, don't start with 5 Gryph-hounds or 16 ether wings. That's just nutty. I was just for the point of illustration doing that. But yeah, as long as you build a list here that comes out anywhere close to 1,000 points, I think you have a solid list on your hands. There's a trade-off. You could bring more hunters and be more melee focused. Just be aware that the melee isn't spectacular, particularly with the low model count that you're going to have. I think better warbands here are going to have the more hurricanes and long strikes than hunters. So just my opinion, but it backed up a little bit here by math. There's always some subjectivity here. So hope you enjoyed this video, and the next video will be the only faction I have left, and that will be the Corvus Cabal. And then after that, I think I will be maybe pre-ordering the Monsters expansion and maybe do some video about that. So thank you for watching, and see you next time.